Sorry about the technicalities there. So thank you, Bill, for that wonderful introduction and greetings from Salt Lake City, where it's not quite as warm as Cyprus, but we're high desert, so no humidity. So it always seems cool even when it's hot. I was really looking forward to coming to Cyprus, a place that I have not visited. I like to travel. And I look forward to meeting many of you next year in Belgium, because for sure we're going to do that in person. I have an hour to change how you think and the way you think about children's future. So I'm going to try and provoke you a little bit to think in different ways about things we know, things we think we know, and things we don't know. And as was mentioned by a number of the earlier speakers this morning, we are well aware that this worldwide pandemic has dramatically increased challenges to children from mental health visits, where in the States we know that mid-year last year there were twice as many visits by teens from mood disorders to practitioners, where we know children spent less time actually being educated, where we know children spent less time socializing. And we are concerned as well about the increased and dramatic amount of time they spent in the last 18 months in front of screens. So without much ado, let's move through these slides. They're available from the ISPA website. They will be up on my website as well in the next couple of days. You can take a look at my website. There's all kinds of articles and then webinars and PowerPoints. They're free for you to look at. I won't capture your name or try and promote anything directly to you from coming to the website. So we always start talks with disclosures. I can tell you I have many more slides today than time. So some of these slides I may move through rather quickly, but I wanted you to have the full content of what I'm going to talk about. As noted, I am a compensated author and test developer. ISPA is not financially responsible for this talk. I receive no compensation and there's no travel. It's my pleasure to do this to help the organization. But I am a compensated speaker for other organizations such as Learning in the Brain, which is a conference that's held a number of times a year in the United States. If you're interested in coming to the US and would like to attend a conference when you come, I suggest you take a look at the Learning in Brain conferences. They're typically held in Boston and San Francisco. Let me start with a short parable about a man that goes fishing. I don't know if we have any colleagues on from Brazil. I've had the opportunity to go down there multiple times and participate in conferences. This is a picture I took of an indigenous man out fishing. And this is a parable that is told in a lot of different ways. This is my way of telling it. This man goes out to fish. He throws his line in the water. He begins to float downstream. And he looks upstream and he sees a child floating in the river. And so he pulls his line in and he paddles over and he pulls this nearly drowning child in. And he begins to paddle to shore and he looks up shore and he sees there's another child drowning. So he picks up this child and now he has two children in his canoe and he's wondering, what were these children doing? He looks upstream and there are tens of thousands of children floating down the river, each one drowning in the adversity of challenges they face. And he has more room in the boat, but he doesn't stop. He continues to paddle to shore. And one of the boys pulls on his arm and asks, "Mister, we have more room. Can we pick up more children?" To which the man responds, "We don't have the time. I need to get to shore and go upriver and find out who's throwing children in the river and make them stop." So the parable is obvious. Children is our next generation. If you want to see the future, you gaze into the eyes of children. We attempt to prepare children for a future that few of us can imagine, given the rapid changes in society and technology and just world events. The man is you and I, trying to prepare children. And the intervention of pulling children in the boat when they drown is a tertiary intervention. Most of what we do as school psychologists or clinicians is tertiary. By that, I mean third level. Primary would be trying to prevent. Secondary would be identifying children at risk and intervening before they struggle. But most of what we're doing is tertiary. When you look at the worldwide statistics of children with mental health problems and the small minority of those that receive help for their problems, you realize that it's a daunting task. And we see more mental health programs, more children on medication, even more diagnoses than ever before. And so, as Dickens wrote, it might be the best of times, but it also might be the most challenging of times for children. And so we need to be more proactive in trying to look at primary and secondary intervention. And even in the schools, we wait until children cross a certain threshold before we service them. I will tell you that, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Foll, Bob Brooks and I have worked together almost 25 years, authoring 14 books, a documentary, a radio series, and multiple articles. And much of what I'm going to talk about today, Bob and I developed together. So it's only fair that I give a heads up to Bob, and you can see the work there, the trade books and the textbooks. And I'm going to talk a little bit about human instincts and a new book we've just authored focusing on the 7 instincts that make us human and what we need to do as educators and parents. So this is what I want to talk about. Bob and I appreciated a number of years ago that what's right about a child is a much better predictor of what might happen to them in their lives. But most of us have not been trained that way. Most of us have been trained to find out what's wrong and to set out to fix it. And that deficit model, the term that we use is pathology, requires an assumption that what we do to fix equals the playing field. However, when you look at longitudinal studies, and I edit the Journal of Attention Disorders, which is a journal that comes out 14 times a year, it's 2,000 pages of research. When we look at the longitudinal studies, the long-term studies of children with certain conditions, such as ADHD, we find that medicines and counseling and school services, while they are helpful and relieve symptoms, don't in much of a significant way change outcome. And for Bob and I, we began focusing on what was right about children. The term resilience was a research term. It's a material science term, meaning to stretch, but come back to your original position. But it's been used beginning in the 1950s to describe processes by which individuals continue to function adequately or well, despite being in circumstances of adversity. So it's not so much recovery as continuing to function well. And Bob and I, after many years of working together, appreciated that the children who seemed to transition well or the best into adult life were not the children who received the most treatment for their challenges, but rather the children who managed to find assets within themselves, within the family or community, within their abilities, to find assets that enable them to continue functioning well and to transition well. And in every risk group, yesterday we talked about children with autism in the pre-conference, but in every risk group, internalizing problems, depression and anxiety, externalizing problems like ADHD or oppositional defiance or conduct problems, developmental problems like autism and learning disabilities. In every risk group, there's always a group of children who seem to fare well over time. And for a long time, it was difficult for us to explain or appreciate why that was, because we couldn't explain it by the number of medicines they received or the number of counseling hours they participated in or the special education programs they were in. We came to understand that it was contributed to by the assets they possessed. And resilience has become a very popular topic. And the second area we looked at, Bob and I, over the years is self-discipline, meaning having the inner control to do what you know. Impulsive individuals often know what to do, but don't do what they know. It's a characteristic of some childhood disorders, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but it occurs in the general population absent a defined diagnosis or condition. And Bob and I realized that knowing what to do didn't equate to doing what you know, and we began focusing on self-discipline, how children acquire the inner regulation and control to do what's expected or to do what is needed to do, even when facing adversity. Those were the two areas we focused principally on. And it eventually occurred to us that we were missing something. We were missing the biological contribution that we as a species, our children, bring to the world. Talking about this idea that what's right about children is a much better predictor of what may happen to them in their lives, and that we must have a balanced approach to helping them manage their adversities, whether it's emotional or behavioral or social or academic, that we must do a better job of focusing on helping them develop the self-discipline to do what they know. But Bob and I appreciated that we were missing something. And over the years, we gathered research on instincts. And that's what I want to focus on today. A number of instincts that are in our species, and I'll explain this, that I think we've overlooked. And we've chosen the word tenacity because we think, and I don't know what the translation is in many other countries, but in English, it's a persistence, the ability to stay with it. These are the three books, the three trade books that really encompass what we've done: Raising Resilient Children, Self-Disciplined Child, and then our new book on tenacity. And what I want to do is cover those instincts. We'll see how much time we have, but let's take a slight side trip, again, to try and shape your thoughts. We have assumed that raising children is a process, as Noam Chomsky pointed out, with language. There's a black box in the brain, and somehow it acquires knowledge, organizes that knowledge, and then children function. We've also assumed a Stepford Wives model. There was a movie many years ago called The Stepford Wives about the perfect wives in a community in Connecticut. Turned out they were robots, and they really weren't human. And we've assumed that all brains of all children are identical, and that what works for one child should work for all. So let me ask, do you ever wonder, do you ever stop and wonder how children learn to speak? Keep in mind, from the age of 18 months to 36 months, a period of a year and a half, children move from not speaking to telling you how to live your life in a year and a half. And if they're in a bilingual home, they learn to do it simultaneously in two languages. Language is the window into the mind. It lets me understand you and you understand me. Yesterday morning, I evaluated an almost 4-year-old, very pleasant little boy who cannot speak. He can make sounds. I think he has an apraxia. His understanding seems to be much better. People thought he had autism. He clearly doesn't have autism. But his inability to develop spoken language posed perhaps the most significant challenge any young child can face. So how do children do it? How do they acquire so much knowledge? And the brain between the ages of 1.5 and 3 is supercharged, 150% of metabolism at that time. How do children learn to manage their emotions? Children are born, there is a TV series, Star Trek. Children are born as Klingons. They deal with the world emotionally, which is how our ancestors, both Homo sapien and the humans that came before us for a couple of million years, we manage the world on our emotions. Well, how do they learn to do that? How do they learn to give the front of the brain time to consider what the middle of the brain already knows? That information about the world comes to the middle of the brain a few milliseconds before it arrives at the front of the brain. And maturation is about learning to wait, to open a window between experience and response, to wait long enough such that you don't just act on emotion. The term Bob and I use is a brain dancing that we borrowed from another colleague, that at any given moment, with enough stress, any of us abandon the logic and rationale of the front of our brains, and in response, act from the middle of the brain emotionally. How do children acquire knowledge? How do they do it? How do they scaffold one piece of information to another piece of information? This is what the mind is all about. And you and I, as psychologists and mental health professionals, our focus is not on the physical brain, but the mind, an abstract creation of the physical brain. It is not a computer. It doesn't work like a computer. That level of self-awareness we possess is unexplained by any scientific theory. And how did the mind evolve? Is it possible to have half a mind? Well, we can see how a nose or an ear or a tail evolved from one species to another. How does a mind evolve? Which of our ancestors, or whom of our ancestors, was the first to have a mind? And not just consider the need for sustenance and survival, but also consider one's place in the world. But this is what you and I work on. And I will tell you that everything else we talk about, whether it's learning or neuropsychology or emotional regulation or behavior or socialization, the issue that most concerns me in the children I see at our clinic, and these are children, many of whom with genetic and brain injuries, is their mind, their mindset, the belief and understanding they come to acquire through their experiences about themselves. And the mind, I think, is more powerful than any other aspect of resource that we provide to children. When a child decides in their mind there's nothing anyone can do to help them, then no amount of help will make a difference. How do children learn to master challenging activities? I will tell you, that's me on my first bicycle. I grew up in New York City. My mother was very prudent, and she decided she would get me a full-size bicycle and put training wheels on it so I could grow into it. And that's about all I could do with it, is sit on it and look really handsome. But it took a long time till I learned to ride that big bicycle. But how do children learn to master those activities? And why is it that some children persevere even in the face of challenge, and other children are easily overwhelmed by even the smallest challenge? How do children learn to socialize? You understand that you could have all the genes to speak. If no one speaks to you, you won't ever speak. You could have all the genes to socialize. If not provided with the opportunity to socialize, you'll never know how to do it. So in our species, genes, multiple genes, this is not eye color or hair color, genes code for complex behaviors that have evolved over millions of years. Language, socialization, critical thinking. These are not single gene phenomena. These are polygenetic genes, various alleles, which are subtypes of genes that combine almost like a gigantic slot machine in a casino, that combine to guide us. But again, genes can't operate without a push from the environment. And that's our responsibility. Our responsibility is to create an environment, whether it's a familial or an academic or a community environment, in which the genes that children bring to the world with them can be shaped and developed, not just to make the unique individual, but to create an individual that is connected and functional and part of a bigger society. You know, how do children create their identities? How do they know? And I think it's wonderful when you look at, that's one of my grandchildren on his first bicycle. He's older now, but we went from my mother buying me that gigantic bicycle that I could barely pedal to now appreciating that we create these little bicycles with no pedals so that children can gain the self-confidence and the physical ability to balance themselves on a bicycle. Children are guided by the nexus of their genes and their experience. And it's our responsibility, whether in our homes, in our communities, in our schools, to create an environment in which experience can guide in an affirmative way the expression of those genes. And two of these instincts are intuitive optimism, and Bob and I have created terms for these. Optimism meaning I think it's going to turn out fine, and intuitive meaning you just know, no one has to tell you. Children are intuitively optimistic. Young children think they can cook, clean, drive the car. We think it's cute, but it is in part the force that drives their ability and willingness to keep trying, even in the face of challenge or adversity. Consider your experiences trying to learn to walk today. How many times would you get up and fall down before you abandon the task? Here in Salt Lake, many of you are aware we had the Olympics a number of years ago. We are a ski town. I'm a skier, or have been, but not a snowboarder. And I tried snowboarding a number of years ago. I fell down a number of times. I was not intuitively optimistic about my chances of becoming a competent ski boarder, and so I gave it up. And children are also intrinsically motivated. 2-year-olds want to help cook and clean and drive the car, and they don't ask for anything in return. And one of the problems we've created in our world, in our guidance with families, in our children's participation in sports, or the way we manage children's challenges at school, we have externalized motivation. And the children who struggle the most tend to have the greatest number of stars and charts and reinforcers. We externalize motivation in the very children that need to have that motivation internalized. A couple of more of these instincts. We solve problems through simultaneous intelligence. Simultaneous is a word coined by A.R. Luria, the Russian neuropsychologist who's one of the fathers of neuropsychology. What does simultaneous intelligence exactly mean? And I don't use the word intelligence much anymore, because for thousands of years, intelligence was defined as how well you solved problems. Not how many years you went to school, not how well you could read or write or do math, but how well you could think critically. And in our schools, we've abandoned that. And to enter gifted programs, children need to not only think critically, but be advanced academically. And the term that Dr. Brooks and I use is simultaneous intelligence, meaning seeing how all the pieces fit together at the same time. If I give you a couple of examples just quickly, it might help you understand. And it's not creativity, because creativity is thinking outside the box. This is using all of the information that's available to you within the box. If I say 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, you only need to know 10 to predict 12. It's a predictable sequence. If I say 1, 3, 6, 10, 15, and ask you the next number, and when we're in person, I bring some of my books, and as people pick the correct answer, they win a prize, they get a book. The next answer to that in the sequence is 21. Each pair of numbers has a gap increasing by 1. You have to consider simultaneously all pieces of information. If I give you 10 facts about an animal and you randomly pick 3, you might choose an animal that matches the 3, doesn't match the remaining 7. And our species is driven to think critically. And when children are given the opportunity to learn how to do it, they acquire it. So we now see intelligence as a malleable phenomena. And we look at the research that demonstrates you can teach kids to think critically, and their grades improve, and their problem-solving ability improves. And we form relationships through empathy. Compassionate empathy means we not just walk in your shoes, but we have an appreciation of your struggle. Altruism as a genuine phenomena, meaning we give of ourselves, not because we expect anything in return. And taking responsibility virtuously, accepting responsibility for what you do and how you do it. And children and adults today have a hard time accepting responsibility. It's always somebody else's fault or somebody else's problem. And finally, measured fairness. We are very consumed with the idea of fairness. It's not fair. Why does it bother us so much? For hundreds of thousands of years, we shared, when we lived in family groups, we shared responsibility, we shared resources, we shared all tasks. But over the last few thousand years, we've come to appreciate that some people do things better than others. And the extreme of that is athletes who receive compensation that, when you stop and think about it, is hard to comprehend for entertaining us. Yes, they can do something others can't do, but the level of compensation they receive seems inconsistent with the importance of the role they play in society. And fairness is a very big deal to us. I have 3 dogs, and I sit them down and each give them a favored treat, but one of them gets a treat that isn't as favored as the other 2. And it doesn't matter which one gets the unfavored treat, the other two grab their treat and run off to consume it. And the third one sits and looks at me, questioning that it's not fair. Even our animals appreciate fairness. You're well aware of the monkey studies in which two macaques can see each other, and in exchange for giving the experimenter a rock through the cage, they're given a favored treat. And after a few exchanges, the experimenter gives the favored treat to one, but gives the other one an okay treat, but not a favored treat. And very quickly, the other macaque screams and yells and jumps up and down and eventually throws the treat back out at the examiner. Fairness. Fairness is in our genes. So those are the seven. As time allows, I'll come back to them for a few minutes, but we are architects. Dan Siegel, who wrote a wonderful book called The Developing Mind, describes us, educators and parents and community providers who interact with children, as architects. We are architects in creating experiences that are genetically programmed, but dependent on brain development. Obviously, if a child's needs are not met, if they're left unnurtured, if they're exposed to certain toxins or adversity, it's difficult for genes to do their job, even if the experience may be appropriate or may be right for what we're trying to develop. So there, around the world, there clearly are challenges today, given the number of children who live at or below the poverty level, which has increased in the last year during COVID. So I see our role as creating experiences to help these genes express themselves. There's me and my dad. A long time ago, my parents met after World War II. I was an only child, and you can see the big smile on my face. I was connected. And of everything we do with children, the sense that they possess, knowing there's a charismatic person in their life that they care about, that believes in them no matter what happens to them, is critical. I joke, if you remember the movie about, why am I blocking, Austin Powers. I was the original mini-me, but look how connected I am. Look at the strength I gathered from my father. And I think every child has to have a charismatic person in their lives. It doesn't have to be a family member. Bob and I have come to appreciate that it can be anyone that is there and supports the child. And again, when kids transition into adult life, what's wrong with them? Their mistakes, their misbehavior, whatever challenge they had, are of little interest. No one asks you what you did wrong, what you couldn't learn, what your biggest problem was. No one really cares. When you transition into adult life, people are interested in your strengths, in your assets. This is a clinic I founded 41 years ago with a child neurologist, and we still see 500 or 600 children a year at this clinic. And a significant percentage have physical problems, as I mentioned, brain injuries or genetic disorders. And I was doing this for about 15 years when I began seeing the children of the first children I worked with. So they grew up, had children of their own, and a great compliment to me, came back to see me. And I appreciated that some of the children I worked with who were doing well because they had a lot of support when they were kids, as adults were struggling because they had yet to find the level of support and the foundation they needed. And some of the kids I worked with, and you've all worked with them, that you come home at night and wonder, you shake your head, how's this child ever going to enter the world in a functional way? I discovered some of them were doing fine. And they weren't doing fine because they'd taken a lot of medicines or had lots of therapies or special education services. They were doing fine because in that transition, they had found a strength. They had found a charismatic person to support them. They had found a purpose in life. They had developed responsibility and empathy. They looked at the world in a way that helped them be positive in dealing with everyday activities, to flourish, if you're familiar with that research, to flourish, rather than to be sad and despondent over what they didn't have. And for thousands of generations, parents, relatives, others prepared children to become functional adults. How did they do it? There were no schools. There were no parenting books. There were no clergy. How did parents prepare children over thousands of generations, not just in Homo sapiens, but in Homo erectus, a human species of ours that lived in Africa for over 1 million years? How did they do it? And I will argue they did it. There you can see a picture of a school, early school among African Americans at a time post-slavery. How did they do it? How did they manage to do it? And I'm going to argue, when you look at how they did it here, I'm going to argue they did it by drawing upon these 7 instincts that evolved over tens of thousands of years. Again, this is not a biological determinist discussion. I don't believe that our children are homunculi, if you're familiar with that term, meaning a tiny person that just grows, or a rose that unfolds, the entire rose is in there. And I don't believe our children are tabula rasas, blank slates upon which we must inscribe the belief and the behavior and the knowledge necessary for adult life. I think there's a push and pull. I don't think it's nurture or nature. I think it's nurture and nature. How did these instincts evolve? And I think they evolved even further when we developed spoken language. And as I pointed out, language is the window into the mind. And at some point, our evolution sacrificed expressive language in the way our vocal cords are placed in our throats. We choke on our food more than any other species. So we've pushed out space to swallow to have vocal cords because we developed this language. And it's the way we communicate. As I point out, it's the window into the mind. It lets you understand me and me understand you. And the second thing that happened, some mutation, perhaps 5 or 10,000 years ago, enabled us to say one thing and think something else. And we are the only species that can travel through time, not in the physical world, but in the mental world. The term is chronesthesia in English, chronesthesia. It enables us to travel through time. You can think about what you were doing yesterday. You can consider what you might do tomorrow, all while rooted physically in the present. And we do it through language. We really don't do it through images. And perhaps language is the greatest evolutionary drive that has enabled we as Homo sapiens, we as a human species to still be here. The others are gone. And I don't think biology is destiny. But I do think it affects probability. So I think we have to understand the developmental and genetic differences. When you look at, this is twin studies, the Minnesota twin studies from the 90s, if you're familiar with them, a significant percentage of who we are, perhaps 80% of who we are, is in our genes. When you look at these identical twins who were reared apart and met as adults, a number of movies have been and documentary have been created with this information. It's a little scary that these adults who've never met but share the same gene pool, look the same, dress the same, marry women who look the same, have the same jobs, have the same likes and dislikes. So if 80% of who we are is in our genes, maybe we should just all stop what we're doing and go out to the beach. But I need you to understand that the 15 or 20% of what we do can influence the outcome in the lives of our children 100%. The parent who takes the time to identify a learning disability in their child early on and seek help, the parent who learns to appreciate that some children are more worried about the world around them than others and begins to create an atmosphere and a dialogue so that that child can develop the skills necessary to manage their temperament. A parent willing to consider a medication for a child whose self-discipline is so immature that they can't function in school or on the playground, that parent's action makes 100% difference in what happens to children over time. So consider instincts here. We'll take a few minutes. It's a complex phenomena. It's allowed mutations to occur over many times. And evolution is about a change for the better. If a mutation increases survival, it's reproduced. If it doesn't, that organism probably doesn't bear others. Some of these increase the chances that babies would survive and thrive and transition into adult life. And Bob and I believe tenacity, or how we proposed it, is composed of 7 instincts, and I've already briefly introduced them. And given our time frame, I probably won't have time to go through many of them. But I've talked about intuitive optimism. I've talked about the idea of starting a task with a belief that there will be an affirmative ending. There's intuitive optimism. And I think our kids are hardwired to acquire knowledge and have that knowledge interact with their genes to functionally transition into adult life. And we believe that that triad, we call that a developmental triad of self-discipline, of resilience, and the harnessing of these 7 instincts is critical to our outcome as an adult. And just to understand, in some species, instincts are fixed patterns of behavior leading to certain outcomes. A bird building a nest for the first time, or a salmon swimming upstream. We look at it differently. We think the research supports that instincts are an intuitive way of thinking or acting that increases the chances of survival and success. And that's how we look at it. And we appreciate that knowing what to do is not the same as doing what you know until you have the opportunity to have certain experiences that increase that probability. So ultimately, success is very much dependent upon experience. And I think these instincts are more important than ever. We call them tenacity. The word tenacity in English is defined as perseverance or doggedness, resolution, stamina. And I'm in the process of gathering definitions of this term in other languages, because some languages do not have this word, and they will borrow it the way, for example, Spanish and Italian have done with resilience. So it provides the mental and emotional fuel. And the question I will challenge you all with is, what do we do? How do we create an environment that will make this difference? And here are the 7 instincts. And I've touched on them. And I'm going to go through the explanation of them rather quickly, because I believe from a time perspective, I'm quickly approaching the end of my time. Motivation. As I pointed out, young children are intrinsically motivated. You don't have to pay them. And what's happened when children struggle to learn or manage their behavior, we provide extrinsic consequences. Children are not punished by reward, but if you don't pair it with some internal motivation, then once the external consequence goes away, then the behavior goes away. Optimism, simultaneous intelligence, empathy, responsibility, altruism, and fairness. You can go to my website or Bob's website. You can read more about these. We are in the process of compiling a scientific edited volume about human instincts and the role they play. But I think this is an important topic moving forward. Our ability to appreciate these instincts and to appreciate how they may change the world for the future. And again, I'm going to jump through this because of time. I talked a little bit about each of these as we were discussing them. And there are some guides here for empathy and responsibility, but from a time frame, I'm not going to have the opportunity to talk about them. I do want to spend a minute talking about 3 others. So in our book and in our work, we focus on these 7, but there are 3 others that I think helped our species survive that now may be the source of a lot of problems. And we think that focusing on the other 7 is the solution to managing these 3. What are the 3? Belief. Belief's a valuable ally in the absence of fact. Do you ever wonder why belief is such a strong phenomenon in our species? For millions of years, you had to believe the sun would come up when it went down. You had to believe you'd find shelter. You had to believe you'd find sustenance. Belief is in our genes. And when belief is modified appropriately, it's extremely important. I would ask you to consider the news. Look at the news in the paper. Listen to the news tonight. And consider how belief out of control contributes to political differences, to differences even in the science of what we know about contagious diseases, to differences among religions, among countries. An extreme, rigid application of belief is responsible for a lot of challenges today. And fear of difference. Yes, to some extent, what children learn culturally drives their dislike or their fear or their uncertainty about others, either the color of their skin or their religion or their behavior or their gender identity, whatever the case may be. But I will argue that for hundreds of thousands of years, you didn't associate with anyone outside of your family group because they might kill you, they might eat you. I think fear of difference, I don't think biology is destiny, but I think there is something genetic driven to it. And the solution isn't necessarily to tell people, don't worry about difference, but to begin by helping people understand why they're sometimes uncomfortable in certain circumstances, and then to learn how to manage that. And finally, dancing brains, an aggressive response to real or perceived threat. Think about it. Look at the violence on the road. It's increased dramatically in the United States, where some minor altercation happens between two drivers and one driver shoots the other driver. And I don't know if this happens in other parts of the world, but very clearly, any of us are brain dancing at any given moment. With enough push, any of us respond aggressively. Threats to ourselves, threats to our families, whatever the case may be. Consider these three. Consider your beliefs. Consider how you look at difference. Consider how you respond when you think there's a perceived or a real threat. And I will argue that those three contribute significantly to many of the challenges we face in the world today. And I will argue that we have to begin by understanding them, not just in others, but in ourselves and in our children. We have to begin by appreciating the solution isn't to tell people what to believe, isn't to tell people don't be afraid of difference, isn't to tell people keep your hands to yourself. All that is well and good. But the true solution to helping us manage these three, which kept us alive for millions of years, I hope you understand that if you had a food 10,000 years ago and I hit you over the head and I took it, I survived. And there were no police, there were no courts, there were no jails. These three instincts evolved in our species because they kept us alive. But I will argue in today's world, these three create almost more adversity than value. And our proposal is that by understanding the other seven instincts, by creating experiences in which those instincts can thrive in ourselves and in our children, we balance the others. It is a competing response. You can't be sitting up or you can't be sitting and standing at the same time. Sometimes we use that when we try and shape behavior. It's a competing response. If you manage your beliefs, your sense of responsibility, your altruism, sense of altruism and behavior towards others, if you live the guidance these instincts provide, then the other three, your belief, your fear of difference, your tendency to respond aggressively, you'll find ways to manage them. So what is this road? Examine your assumptions about why children do what they do, why they succeed at certain things, why they don't. Challenge self-defeating attributions. challenge beliefs that are not rational, but challenge them by offering children the opportunity to consider fairness, to think critically, to act altruistically. And I think we have to help kids find the term we use in our research, in our writing, is islands of competence. If you don't have an island of competence and you struggle with an ocean of challenge and inadequacy, it's difficult to succeed. And one of the variables that we find in the research literature on resilience, more than any other, is that children who face adversity, who develop some level of competence in something, arts, academic, science, hobby, they seem to find the strength to function better and to deal with the adversities and challenges in their lives. And I will tell you that the very same qualities that predict good outcome for all children predict good outcome for the children that I sometimes refer to as Job's children, the children with multiple problems that often keep you and I up at night when we try and consider how can we help these children negotiate childhood successfully and transition happily into adult life. Listen and learn. Sometimes children just want to be heard. Let kids learn from experiences, but not such experiences that they drown and fail. One of the digs about the last couple of generations of children is that we haven't allowed them to fail and that everyone gets an award. And children don't learn by experience. They learn only through success, which is, again, not true. Mistakes are valuable resources from which to learn. Be proactive in the face of problems and take a long-term view. Children are not salmon and snakes. They're not born with sufficient instinct ready to reach adult life. They're not animals like bear cubs requiring a year with a mother to model behavior. They're not higher primates like chimps and orangutans or gorillas that require a few years in a family group. I joke that nowadays our children are not ready to grow up and be adults till they're age 30. Transition to adulthood is a long process. It's at least 10 or 15 years. And I think we need to take a long-term view. One of my projects is asking what schools will be like in 50 years. Perhaps we'll address this at a future ISPA conference. And the term I'm using is inside-out schools. What will happen to schools 50 years from now? Will there be physical institutions, or will we learn in different ways? And I am arguing that teachers will shift from being sources of knowledge and information to being guides, to being instructional coaches, to being mentors, to creating environments in which children can learn to motivate themselves. It's not our job to motivate children. It's our job to create environments in which they can find and seek motivation. I'm going to go quickly through this one and just focus on this last slide. This is from a group of researchers. It's 21 years from publication. I use this with teachers, with parents, when people ask, so what is it we want for the future of our children? We want them to be competent, academically, socially, vocationally. We want them to have confidence and a positive identity. We want them to be connected in healthy ways to others. We want them to develop character, positive values, integrity, and overall values. We want them to care and have compassion. I think this 5C model is a wonderful way of helping stakeholders understand what we do as psychologists, what our goals are, what our roles are, and what our interest is. And our interest extends far beyond the 20% of children with language or emotional or behavioral or academic challenges. It extends to all children. You know, the idea of stress hardiness, a belief that we can all grow from our experiences. Dan Brown wrote, may our philosophies keep pace with our technology, may our compassion keep pace with our powers, and may love, not fear, be the engine of change. And I will challenge all of you after this conference to think about how you want to live your life, how you want to create the relationships in your life, how you want to educate, how you want to guide and advise, whether you want to pathologize or demonize or moralize the people in your lives and the children that you work with, or whether you want to appreciate and take an affirmative view in which you understand how to harness, how to utilize, how to manage these qualities of resilience. And if you're unfamiliar with them, I'd encourage you to read more. This idea of self-discipline, which is an increasingly challenging commodity for our children, and this idea of tenacity, or the instincts that make us human, and the instincts that challenge the very humanness of who we are and the potential for our future. I hope to see you all in person in Belgium. There's my website. I answer all my email. I've got a Twitter and a Facebook where I'll post some things. I have a TED Talk there that you can listen to that I did a number of years ago about the children in our clinic. I want to thank everyone at the University of Cyprus for their time and their diligence, and Anthony for her time over the last 2 years. And most of all, Bill Fole, who I've known for probably 40 years from NASP, the National Association of School Psychologists here in the US. And I very much appreciate Bill's perseverance in inviting me and chasing me to come and speak at this conference. And I look forward to seeing you all in Belgium. Thank you all very much.